You see, every once in a while, Europe reminds us, not with ships, guns, or soldiers this time, but with words, with language, that they never truly stopped fearing the power of Benin. Now, just yesterday, 28 October 2025, Svenska Dagbladet, one of Sweden's biggest and leading newspapers, published an article about the planned return of Benin artifacts. But instead of focusing on justice or the significance of returning what was stolen, they framed it with a question. Where will the artifacts end up? In a museum or with a king? You see, that single line tells the whole story. It carries the weight of centuries. You see, it is 2025, yet European journalists still write as though African heritage must be supervised, as if we, the descendants of those who created these masterpieces, need guidance to keep them safe. As if we need permission to own what was created by our own ancestors. Now, that is not all. Then came the most revealing passage. In 2023, Nigeria's president announced that the artifacts Germany returned belong to the current king, or Oba, as he is called in Nigeria. The announcement caused indignation in the West. Now, did you see that? Or Oba, as he is called in Nigeria. Like, seriously. You see, that line alone tells you how little they truly understand. Because anyone who truly understands Africans' history would know that the Oba is not just a king. He is the political and spiritual heart of a civilization whose continuity Europe once tried to erase. The Oba of Benin is not just a king. He is Benin's continuity, the living link between ancestors, the people, and the land. He is the great-great-grandson of Oba Ovorame Nogbaisi, the same monarch from whom these heritages were stolen in the first place. To reduce that to a Nigerian king is to flatten an entire civilization into a caricature they can easily process. You see, it's not an innocent description, it's simplification. It reduces a sacred institution to a curiosity that fits Western grammar. Now, the article also says the announcement caused indignation in the West. Of course it did, right? Because nothing unsettles the colonial mind more than the idea of Africans deciding for themselves what to do with what belongs to them. It's as if restitution is acceptable, but only as long as Europe still gets to define the terms. That's the problem right there. Western eyes. The same eyes that saw civilization everywhere else, but refused to see it in Africa unless it mirrored Europe. The same eyes that labeled our kingdoms tribes, our altars fetishes, and our art primitive. So after reading the article, I reached out to the reporter Elizabeth Anderson and pointed out how the article reproduced some colonial perspectives. That subtle assumption that African heritage must pass through Western validation before it can be respected or preserved. To her credit, Elizabeth responded. She acknowledged that the article did reproduce some colonial perspectives and said she was glad I made her aware of it. You see, that's important because it shows what can happen when we speak up instead of just staying silent. And that's exactly what my documentary film, Echoes of Benin, is all about. Not attacking individuals, not to attack individuals, but challenging inherited ways of seeing Africa. Because when we correct the narrative, we are not just defending our history, we are reshaping how the world learns about it. You know why? Because these bronzes are not just art pieces. They are testimonies of memory, massacre, and mastery. They don't belong in footnotes of colonial history. They belong in the consciousness of a people reclaiming their story. They belong in our consciousness. And now, to answer the question of where will the artifacts end up, let me put it this way, without any ifs or buts. You see, while I deeply respect the vision behind the Museum of West African Art, MOA, and the people working hard, working earnestly to make it a reality. MOA is one of its kind, no doubt. However, I can't fully agree with the idea that Africa's heritage can only be protected once it is enclosed in glass inside a Western modeled museum. Please get the context. Because that ideal, though well intentioned, still carries the same colonial echo that our culture is safe only when curated, not when lived. And I trust that the brilliant minds behind MOA understands this, that they have already begun to separate preservation from paternalism and filtered out the colonial framework from the protection of Africa heritage. You see, Benin's heritage was never meant to be frozen behind display light. If you watched Echoes of Benin, I talked about that. Benin heritage breathes through rituals, through craftsmanship, through continuity. The museum can complement that, yes, but it should never ever replace it. Because the Oba's palace was not merely royal property. It was and still is a living archive of a people's soul. The bronzes, ivories, and carvings were not ornaments. They were documents of history, inscribed in mental and memory. To question their return to the Oba is to deny that connection between heritage and identity. So when Western media ask, where will the artifacts end up? The answer is simple. They will return to where they were conceived, within a civilization that never stopped revering them, even when the world pretended to forget. So at this point, it's imperative that the world understands something deeper. Benin wasn't just conquered militarily. It was politically dismembered and psychologically disarmed. Its symbols of power, the bronzes, the ivory, the coral, and the court gills, were all targeted because they represented a civilization that didn't bow easily. So let's call it what it is. This so-called concern is not about preservation. It's about possession. They don't fear corruption. They fear correction. They fear a historical balance that no longer flatters their empire. So Benin doesn't need permission to be great again. These artifacts don't strengthen the king. They restore the truth. And no matter how far they travel, they still answer to Benin. But the story doesn't end here. Because when I reached out to the reporter Elizabeth. She listened. That small moment of awareness reminds us that speaking up works, speaking up matters. It proves that when we challenge distortion with truth, even politely, something begins to shift. And maybe that's how we rebuild the dignity that centuries of misrepresentation try to bury, not through outrage, but through clarity. One correction at a time, one conversation at a time, one act of courage at a time. Because the fight to reclaim our history isn't just about artifacts. It's about authority over meaning. It's about ensuring that the next generation reads Africa's history through African eyes, not through the footnotes of empire. So yes, today it's Svenska Dagbladet. Tomorrow perhaps pseudo scholars, pseudo intellectuals, pseudo professors and curators like Susan Blair, Bondarenko or Geoffrey Waru will also have the humility to retrace their steps, to admit that the narrative of Africa they inherited was filtered through colonial lens of conquest. And when that happens, when truth finally humbles arrogance, our story will no longer need to shout. It will simply stand as it always has, unbroken, unbent, and beautifully benign. Oba Gatokbe Ise.